Hello and welcome back to Russ's Movie Corner. My name is Russ, and as you can see, I am not sitting in front of my movie corner. I have my How Sharp Is Your Sword shirt on, I have no movie next to me, and judging by the frame around me, we are back, taking down another atheist. Today, back on the chopping block is Vice Rhino, and his video, The Bible Proves Jesus' Miracles, because it's in the Bible. I have a fluffy dragon right next to me. He may or may not join me. Depends on what he's feeling like. He's got kind of an agitated feel to him right now, so he's probably just going to stay off frame. And know that he doesn't have mange. We shave him for temperature control purposes. So, on the last video, okay, that we just looked at, or that we just did, the guy basically made a bunch of claims, again with zero sources, then made the dubious claim that he needed proof that Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels converted people, because he said nobody in the Synoptic Gospels converted people. So at the end there, we did a whole entire list of videos, and I spent a lot of time in the opening trying to explain one of the reasons why I do this stuff and why it takes me a long time to do these videos. Because I'm not just making spurious claims and moving on. I'm actually providing evidence to back up the claims. Okay? So let's jump back in and let's continue on.
What's more, Jesus' own resurrection from the dead was the climax of all of his miracles and serves as perhaps the most convincing miracle of all.
And that is the one miracle in the Synoptics that you can actually say is supposed to be convincing.
Really? Wow! I didn't know that! Sarcasm aside, we already knew that, dude. Okay? So, are you gonna back up? Are you gonna provide any source to the claim that you're about to say it never happened? Are you?
But even then, coming back from the dead isn't all that special in Christianity. You yourself just finished with a list of people that were raised from the dead who were not God incarnate. And there are more, including a whole horde of zombies that all resurrected about the same time as Jesus.
Nope. Okay. Where was the zombie outbreak? Can you prove they were zombies? Can you prove that they were chowing down on people? Or that they were being controlled somehow? Because it sounds like you're just saying that they were zombies to make it sound rather silly. Okay? He's parroting Aaron Ra's claims again. Aaron Ra makes this claim in debates all the time. So does Matt Dillahunty. Okay? This is nothing new in the atheist circles. Saying, Matthew has zombie outbreak. It's stupid. But this proves, okay, that these people, okay, were raised by Jesus. Okay? And it's also showing that Jesus has the power over life and death. Duh. That's the whole point, son. I mean, I think you'd have probably tried to figure that out by now. But again, no sources to back up his claim of zombie outbreak. There wasn't a zombie outbreak because those people would have had new bodies. Okay? As it says, it went into the holy city and appeared to many. It doesn't say it chowed down on many. So I don't know where the hell they get this claim of zombies.
So either God came to earth in human form a number of times, or Jesus' resurrection doesn't automatically point to him being God.
Of course it does. Because only God can raise the dead. I would have thought you'd have figured this out by now. I mean, like, okay. So, Elisha, right? The prophet Elisha, okay, didn't raise that boy from the dead. God did. Elisha laid across the boy and prayed to God, Lord, raise this boy from the dead. Okay? Like, over and over and over he does this. Okay? It's pretty crystal clear if you bothered to actually read the Bible. Okay? 2 Kings 3, no, 4. Sorry, 2 Kings 4, starting in verse 8. Okay? One day Elisha went to Shunem, and a well-to-do woman was there who urged him to stay for a meal. Whenever he came by, he stopped there to eat. She said to her husband, I know that this man comes often our way as a holy man of God. Let's make a small room on the roof and put a bed and a table and a chair and a lamp for him. Then he can stay whenever he comes to us. One day when Elisha came, he went up to his room to lay down there. He said to the servant Gehazi, call the Shunammite. So he called to her, and she stood before him. Elisha said to him, tell her, you have gone to all this trouble for us. Now what can be done for you? Can we speak on your behalf to the king or the commander of the army? She replied, I have a home among my own people. What can be done for her? Elisha asked. Gehazi said, well, she has no son, and her husband is old. And then Elisha said, call her. So he called her. And she stood in the doorway. About this time next year, Elisha said, you will hold a son in your arms. No, my lord, she objected. Don't mislead your servant, O man of God. The woman became pregnant, and the next year about that time she gave birth to a son, just as Elisha had told her. The child grew, and one day he went out to his father, who was with the reapers. My head, he cried to his father. His father told a servant, carry him to his mother. After the servant had lifted him up and carried him to his mother, the boy sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. She went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, and then shut the door and went out. She called her husband and said, please send me one of the servants and a donkey so I can go to the man of God quickly and return. Why go to him today? He asked. It's not the new moon or the Sabbath. It's all right, she said. She saddled the donkey and said to her servant, lead on, don't slow down for me unless I tell you. So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When he saw her in the distance, the man of God said to his servant Gehazi, look, there's the Shunammite. Run and meet her, and ask her, are you all right? Is your husband all right? Is your child all right? Everything is all right, she said. When she reached the man of God at the mountain, she took hold of his feet. Gehazi came over to push her away, but the man of God said, leave her alone, she is in bitter distress. But the Lord has hidden it from me, and has not told me why. Did I ask you for a son, my lord? She said. Didn't I tell you don't raise my hopes? Elisha said to Gehazi, tuck your cloak in your belt, take my staff in your hand, and run. If you meet anyone, do not greet him, and if anyone greets you, do not answer. Lay my staff on the boy's face. The child's mother said, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. So he got up and followed her. Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the boy's face, but there was no sound or response. So Gehazi went back to meet Elisha and told him, the boy has not awakened. When Elisha reached the house, there was the boy lying dead on his couch. So he went in, shut the door on the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. Oh, I'm sorry, what were you lying? He prayed to the Lord. Then he got on the bed and lay upon the boy, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. As he stretched himself out upon him, the boy's body grew warm. Elisha turned away and walked back and forth in the room. They got on the bed, stretched out upon him once more. The boy sneezed 7 times and opened his eyes. Elisha summoned Gehazi and said, call the Shunammite, and he did. When she came in, she said, take your son. She came in, fell at his feet, bowed to the ground, then she took her son and went out. So, again, Elisha didn't raise the boy from the dead. God did. At the behest of Elisha praying to God and saying, God, please raise this boy from the dead. Okay? And the gospel accounts of people raising from the dead, that this guy's going, oh, well, he just finished this whole list of people raising from the dead. That doesn't show Jesus' resurrection is special. No. Who was the one raising people from the dead? Jesus. Okay? which just goes to show how biblically illiterate this guy truly is. Because God is creator, sustainer, and author. So is Jesus. Jesus was given this power because he pre-existed his incarnate self. Ergo, he is God made flesh. We'll be right back. And we're back. So, let's jump back into it.
But also, I'll take shit that didn't happen for 500, Alex.
Do you have a source to back that up? No? Didn't think so. You gotta love it when they don't read the Bible and then they turn around and make a stupid claim like that. And then sit there and, I'll take stuff that didn't happen. Okay. But you haven't provided a single source yet, son.
Number 3, even the enemies of Christ attested to his works.
Ooh, okay, so now we're getting somewhere. You have writings from some of the scribes, Pharisees, or whoever else witnessed the miracles of Jesus, right? It's not just more stuff that's being claimed by the Bible. You actually have someone attesting to the miracles that isn't a Bible character.
Funny that you want someone who isn't a Bible character, quote unquote, when you yourself haven't provided a single source to back up any claim that you've made. You know what we call that? Hypocrisy. And you might want to understand that the eyewitnesses to Jesus' miracles also wrote down the objections to said miracles. In fact, I literally read one of those in John. After Lazarus was raised from the dead, the Pharisees were literally like, wow, this guy's doing stuff, we need to kill him. Because the Romans are going to come and squash this place. And what are we going to do? And their justification for it was, better that one person die and the whole nation saved than the whole nation perish. Funny that. Also, Saul. You know Saul, later Paul. He persecuted the Christians. Okay? Then saw the resurrected Christ on the road to Damascus. Yeah, that Saul. And it was likely that Paul was present during Jesus' life ministry, because he was studying at the feet of Gamaliel. He likely not interacted with Jesus, except maybe during the trial. Okay? But Gamaliel, Saul's teacher, was there. Because he actually alludes to that when he talks to when he talks to the other Pharisees in Acts. He actually alludes to Jesus' trial and a few other parts of it. Okay, so Gamaliel was there, and Paul was taught at the feet of Gamaliel. Okay.
Though many of Jesus' enemies who witnessed his miracles rejected him as the Messiah and attempted to undermine his ministry, even they did not deny the miracles that he worked.
Not denying something is not the same as attesting to it.
Wait. Hold up a second. Oh my God. What hypocrisy is this? Okay. You pop atheists say this all the time. About us, Christians. Okay? You guys use that as a justification for evolution when we bring up certain topics all the time. It's actually quite pathetic. Just because you object to it doesn't mean it didn't happen. I see it in my comment section all the time. Okay? I've seen videos where people say that. when they're doing an evolution creation debate.
Well, just because you object to it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Just because you say France doesn't exist doesn't mean that there isn't a place called France which you can actually visit. And that's not an equivocation fallacy, folks. Okay? It's... Oh, man. Double standards much? So let me ask you this question then. Why would the gospel authors, okay, these eyewitnesses, put the objections in? Wouldn't it make more sense to leave them out? Or have everyone agree? Trouble is, that isn't how it happened. Josephus tells us that much in his writings. Ergo, the eyewitnesses knew credibility was better. Hence, they left the objections in. It goes back to what I was saying before about people and their, like a Jim Jones style preacher. Okay? Like, if you talk to somebody, let's say you walked up to the cult when they first started out. So you walked up to some members of the cult, and you asked them if Jim Jones was abusing them, let's say, or was taking advantage of them, or was doing something to make them think a certain way. They would say, "Oh no, Jim Jones is the most wonderful person on the planet. He is so good. He is such a man of God." They would never tell you anything negative. It wasn't until he started getting more militant, started getting the guns, started doing some of the things, and then left for Africa, that certain people that didn't go with him started coming up with stories about him. Because they'd broken through the indoctrination and they started telling stories about him. Nobody ever did that with Christ. Same thing happened with David Koresh. Okay? In Waco. Same thing. In fact, I did a video on that. I covered in one of my, I think it was Christy Burke videos, I covered Jim Jones and David Koresh at length. Okay? Because I wanted to compare somebody making themselves out to be Christ versus the Christ we see in the Bible. Okay? David Koresh was never Christ. But his followers, even some of the followers that knew him, okay, even years later in interviews and various things, and there's even some people that wrote books on their time at Branch Davidian Complex, okay, who said that, you know, he fancied himself to be Christ. And we all swallowed it hook, line, and sinker because we were all spiritually starving. We wanted to believe in that. We wanted to make him into something because we thought that would give him more credibility in our eyes. So they never brought up any of the bad stuff. They only brought up the good, okay? Until after it started coming out, things were happening inside the Branch Davidian complex. Then were the stories coming out to the news. Because there were some people who had broken away and gotten out of the Branch Davidian complex, and they were like, we have this issue, we have this problem, there are things going on here that we can't explain, we don't understand, it needs to end, and we're not sure exactly why things are the way they are, okay? And so, this is Mookie, by the way. And so that's the point, okay? So, you know, if you're going to make this kind of claim, then again, the burden of proof is on you to back it up, son. And you haven't done that. Ever.
My oldest child went to a theme park the other day, and when I asked how it was, they said they almost died. I did not deny that. This does not mean that I am attesting to their near-death experience. Though, I will at this point deny it. It's most likely that they were just scared on a ride that was operating properly and was perfectly safe the entire time. At least, that's what I tell myself. Don't listen to the Action Park episode of Citation Needed before sending your kids on a field trip to an amusement park.
After Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead in the presence of many Jews, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, "What shall we do? For this man works many signs."
Okay, I suppose if they actually said that, that would be attesting to Jesus' miracles. But how do we know that they actually said that?
Because John the Apostle's family was on the Sanhedrin. Oh, didn't know that, did you? Well, another fail, Mr. Better Sourced.
Even if we throw out all scholarship on the matter and assume that John was an eyewitness to the life of Jesus, how did he know what the chief priests and Pharisees discussed at their council to which he would not have been invited? And that is the most generous position it is possible to take on the matter.
Again, John was an eyewitness. And again, his family was on the Sanhedrin. Okay, history lesson time, Mr. Better Sourced. There are 3 parts to the Sanhedrin. There's the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which are the priests. There were the scribes, which were the secretaries. And then there was the Sanhedrin itself, which was made up of prominent members of Israel, like businessmen, traders, those type of people. People that had some money and some wealthy influence inside the actual council. Okay? After the Babylonian exile and return, in Ezra and Nehemiah, no one knew who the Levitical priests were. At that point, genealogies were somewhat clouded. Okay, it's why 2nd Chronicles contains a little bit of the Babylonian exile genealogy, the after exile genealogies, because they were trying to figure out who some of the Levitical priests were. They were trying to figure out who the Judahites were, basically the sons of Judah, the son of Jacob. So, and besides, they didn't have, they also didn't have a temple. They were told to build one by the Assyrian king. So, during the 400-year silence between Malachi and Jesus' coming, they needed priests to serve according to the law of Moses. Hence, Pharisees and Sadducees were created. The Pharisees were the more conservative sect, while the Sadducees were the more liberal, i.e. they were skeptical of any miracles could truly take place. Sound familiar? And they had the spiritual power in Israel. In fact, they had so much spiritual power in Israel that they could throw people out of a synagogue. We actually see this in John chapter 8 with the healing of the man born blind, right? They toss him out of the synagogue because he basically challenged their spiritual authority. Okay? Which is why Jesus attacked their hypocrisy. Duh. Because they would do one thing and say another. So they would walk around and tell people, "Oh, we are the spiritual giants. Listen to us. Do this, do that," and then they would go and do something completely opposite to it. Okay, and so Jesus called them out rightly on their hypocrisy. Okay, and to help in spiritual matters, the Sanhedrin was formed. Okay, and it was also to help. It was also kind of a bridge between Herod and the Pharisees as well, because Herod was an appointee of the Romans. He wasn't actually Jewish, as far as we know. Some people say he might have been a Bedouin, which was the tribes kind of down in Arabia. They were what is now known as the Arabian Peninsula. So, let me ask you a question. How do you think Peter got into the courtyard of the temple during Jesus' trial? It's actually in the book of John, if you've ever read it. I can tell you. John let him in. Okay? Literally, John let him in. Okay? So, because, it's like, Peter was one of the most well-known followers of Jesus. Like, literally, the woman, one of the servant girls, literally sits there and is like, "Hey, you were a follower of Jesus." He's like, "No, I'm not." And then she's like, yes, I saw you with them. And he's like, no, I don't know what you're talking about, woman. So, yeah, it's like, it's like this guy has no clue, okay, what any of this is, okay? It's absolutely friggin' pathetic to think that this guy knows anything, and he's not even going to back up a single one of these claims with any sources, okay? Because if he'd even done a modicum of research, then he could have found out that John's family was on the Sanhedrin, and it was likely that John walked in, kind of following the crowd at a distance, snuck Peter into the courtyard, and then went to the meeting, and that's likely how he knew. And it's also likely how he knew what the chief priests and the Pharisees were doing, because he's getting that information from his father, who sits on the Sanhedrin. Okay. So let's leave it there for now, and then I'll be back later to finish this up. You'll be back in less than a second. And we're back. So, we were talking about, in the last section of the video, because for you it's been less than a second, but for me it's been almost a day. But basically I just kind of wanted to kind of reiterate that, we were given this guy a little bit of a history lesson about, him kind of sitting there saying, well, John wouldn't have had access to some of this information. And yes, he would have, because John's family was actually on the Sanhedrin, which is how Peter got into the courtyard during Jesus' trial, which is the whole point that, why we believe that these are eyewitness accounts. Because when we actually look at the historicity of some of these things, it actually makes a lot of sense when we see it from that point of view. So, let's jump back into this, and we'll continue on.
In reality, the author of John was definitely not an eyewitness. He was writing at least 60 years after Jesus' death, and he did not get his account from eyewitnesses.
Source? Oh, that's right. Trust me, bro. Fail. And, no. John's author was John the Apostle. Okay? And, I mean, if you're saying 60 years after, you're thinking 90 AD, even if that was when John was writing his gospel, which would have been the time that he was writing the Apocalypse, aka Revelation, then you might have a leg to stand on to say, oh, it's been 60 years, how would John know, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's likely that he was writing his gospel around the time that he wrote his letters, which was actually probably in the 70s. And then once he was exiled to the island of Patmos, he received his revelation, and then that's when he passed that around. So, yeah, we have it on good authority. Again, Dr. Jim's, links in the description. Okay, so that much is obvious. Okay, so yeah, again, just fail.
How could he possibly have known the details of a conversation that happened in private 60 years before he wrote about it? I couldn't tell you what was discussed 60 years ago in a meeting of the church I grew up in, and neither could anyone that I still know that goes to that church, even the ones who are old enough to have been present for that meeting, which, actually, given the demographics of that particular church, is most of them.
So your only source you bring up for your claim is an anecdotal story about people from the church that you grew up in not knowing about a supposed meeting that happened 60 years ago? Yet someone like my parents can remember what they had for breakfast, lunch, dinner, where they were, what was going on the day JFK was killed. that's not anecdotal because we actually know the historical event of JFK's death. And there are a lot of people who can tell you exactly where they were, what they were doing, what was going on when that happened. The same thing with the moon landings. Same thing with 9/11. Okay? So, if something extraordinary happened, like, I don't know, a man rising from the grave, you don't think people wouldn't remember that event even decades later? Like, my parents remember JFK's death 60 years ago, 70 years ago now. Yeah, that was like 1963 or 62. Okay? And both my mom and dad can remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard about JFK's death. And they saw the footage on the screen. I mean, hell, it's been 24 years, like, next week as of filming this. Like, literally a week from today is 9/11 as filming this, because this is September 4th. Yeah, I still frickin' remember what the hell happened on 9/11. I mean, dude, this is two fallacies wrapped into one. Two logical fallacies wrapped into one. One, it is an argument from anecdotal evidence. And two, it is a weak equivocation fallacy. Okay? Because this anecdote doesn't include something extraordinary that happened right before said event. Okay? Like a man rising from the grave. If something extraordinary was happening at his church and they were holding a meeting on that, then I'll bet a lot of people could remember what was going on there. Okay? I mean, I still remember that my church back starting in about 1998 or 99, okay, started talking about building a building called Life University. They actually wanted to make it a complete university. They wanted to have classrooms. They wanted to have it be like a seminary. Okay, so they called it Life University. I remember meetings. I remember the plans. I was never a part of it, but I remember a lot of this stuff. And I bet that if I went to some of the members of the church, which aren't actually going to that church anymore, they're actually going to a different church, but I'll bet if I went to members of that church that were present at the time that all of this was going on, I'm pretty sure that I could probably, like, get, like interview them about meetings that were held, about the plans. I still remember walking through the building when it was being built and seeing all of the forest of timbers, basically, because all of the studs were up, and and you could walk around the building, and I remember the pastor kind of taking people on tours and saying, yeah, this is going to be a kitchen, that's going to be some classrooms, that's going to be my new office, this is going to be the gymnasium, this is going to be this building. I still remember all of that stuff, okay? Because it was a huge undertaking that almost bankrupted the whole church. And there was a huge number of people, including my parents, that left over that, okay? Because they were unwilling, because afterwards, the preacher would stand up, and generally speaking, the preacher would stand up and come up and kind of say, this is the time that we're going to give our tithes and offerings, so, let's go to God with a joyful heart and a cheerful giving attitude, and, all this kind of stuff. And then he turned that into, like 10-minute mini-sermons, okay, 10 to 15-minute mini-sermons on, like, why we, as, the congregation, should be handing them money, okay? And it wasn't prosperity gospel nonsense. It was just the church, the people were starting to tighten up their belts because they were like, this project is getting out of hand. and we don't want to pay this money anymore. And he's standing up there basically scolding the church for not giving enough. So, I mean, you know, I mean, I'll bet that I could probably go to the people who were on a lot of the committees, and I could bet I could talk to them. They might not remember every single word that was spoken, but I'll bet you they could probably give me enough of a summary that I could reconstruct arguments. Because that's how, like, docudramas work. Okay? Like, for instance, Bohemian Rhapsody. Okay? Brian May and I can't remember the guy's name. He was the drummer for the band. They were producers on the film. And they were also, like, script supervisors, okay? They actually were there to give interviews and to give statements and to talk about things, to kind of talk about their dramas, the band members, and, you know, various things like that. And I'll bet that Brian May doesn't remember every single conversation that happened. But he probably remembered enough of a general idea, and so did the drummer, that the writers, the actual writers of the film that sat down and constructed the scenes, could probably reconstruct a fairly accurate depiction of what that was. Now, there's another point to this that this guy's going to dismiss out of hand because he'll say it's supernatural, it doesn't matter. But the Holy Spirit, Jesus actually says in John that when the Holy Spirit comes, and I think he also mentions it in a couple of the other Gospels, he says when the Holy Spirit comes, he will remember things for you. He will give you words to say. He will also help you recollect this time you had with me, so that you will be able to tell people why this is happening. Because a lot of things happen in the Gospels, and like Matthew says it, I think Luke says it, and I know John says it. Like something will happen, and the disciples will be standing around bewildered, and then they will add in a caveat sentence that basically says, you know, because they didn't understand what Jesus was saying at the time, or what Jesus was doing at the time. Like in the feeding of the 5,000, okay? Like, you know, the disciples are, you know, Jesus is saying, you know, have everybody sit down. And they're going, but Jesus, we have nothing to feed these people with. And he's going, well, find out what we do have. And they say, you know, five loaves and 2 fish. And he says, great, have everybody sit down, let's figure this out. And then they start breaking it, he blesses it, they start breaking it and handing it out to people, and it's literally multiplying as it goes along. Okay? And Jesus says later, you know, like, how many basketfuls did we collect? 12. After the 4,000, 7, do you not yet understand? Okay? 12 and 7 were very important numbers in the Jewish lexicon. Okay? 12, the number of tribes. Okay? 7 is the number of days that the earth was created in. It was created in 6 days, and on the 7th he rested. Okay? So how many days are in the week? You rest on the seventh day, the Sabbath. So the whole point was that Jesus was showing them that it's like, this is done to show you who I am. And that's the whole point. This is the whole point. And this guy is totally failing at this point. Okay? It's absolutely insane to think that this guy knows anything about the Bible, about history, about anything. Okay? Because if your only argument here is an argument from anecdotal evidence that is a weak equivocation fallacy, you have 0 legs to stand on, son, because you're committing 2 logical fallacies in one statement. Man, and you guys love to make up new fallacies to try to throw at us Christians whenever we are trying to explain something. You go, well, that's this logical fallacy. That fallacy doesn't exist. Yes, it does. I just made it up. And these are two actual logical fallacies. An argument from anecdotal evidence, okay, and equivocation fallacies. Both of those are actual logical fallacies. And he's committing both of them in one statement. That is hilariously funny to me.
Even if I had an eyewitness to interview, they couldn't accurately tell me what happened at this point. Why would it have been any different for John? So, no, we don't actually have Jesus' enemies attesting to his miracles. We have Jesus' followers claiming that they attested to Jesus' miracles in a book that is notorious for wanting to make Jesus seem as powerful as possible and can't have anyone doubting him ever, even if they don't like him.
And where does it say that? Did I miss that part in the gospel somewhere? Is that what you think John meant by that? If that's what you think John meant by that, why the hell would it contain what his enemies think? That doesn't make any sense. If your whole intent, if your sole intent was to never have anyone doubt, okay, why would you have the Pharisees asking for signs? Why would you have the Pharisees talking about killing someone? Why would you have the Pharisees telling Nicodemus that he's a Galilean? Even though I don't think he was from Galilee. Okay, it was a slam because he was trying to say, I was there when he did certain miracles, and they're like, are you a Galilean too? Because it was a slam. Okay? Why would all of that stuff be in there if you were trying to make the guy seem like Superman? Doesn't it seem better that it would make more sense to make him seem like he had no weaknesses, no enemies, no nothing? I mean, this just doesn't make any sense. Also, John was answering heresy when he wrote the gospel, which is why he's saying us eyewitnesses are writing these things down to tell you and to show you what Jesus did and the miracles that us eyewitnesses attest to. Okay? Irenaeus was extremely clear on that. Okay? Like, I mean, all you have to do, it would be to just read Irenaeus is against heresies. He's very clear about the purpose of John's gospel. It was to make things happen. Are you wanting to come up, Dev? All right, come here. Come on. Come on, Dev. Hey. No? Okay. Devlin's right here. He might be joining me. So, Irenaeus also was closer to the author than you are. What I mean by that is historically, okay? He was actually, like, probably about 100 years after John, okay, was writing his gospel. And he's attesting that it was John the apostle of the Lord, the one whom Jesus loved, the disciple whom Jesus loved in his book. That's how he refers to him, okay? So we have it on good authority that's what it is, because Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who himself was a disciple of John, the apostle of the Lord. You coming up? You coming up? Oh, come on. This is Devlin, everybody. Hi. Okay. So, we have a follower of a follower, okay, Polycarp, who witnessed John write his gospel, okay, whom we have the writings of, versus a guy on YouTube, okay, 2,000 years later, who claims to be, quote, better sourced than the Bible, okay, who hasn't provided one single source or fact to back up his claims. Only one anecdote, which in and of itself is a logical fallacy. Okay? The reason why the argument from anecdote is a logical fallacy is because it's unprovable in 99.9% of cases. Okay? Like, if you could find this guy's church that he supposedly grew up in, okay? Not saying that he didn't, just saying if you could, okay? And if you could go there, and if you could talk to people about this supposed meeting that took place 60 years ago, then if those people truly didn't remember what was said at that meeting, only then would this become a fact, not just an anecdotal story. It would actually become a fact of, okay, these people, truly had a meeting, and there was a bunch of people who didn't remember what that meeting was about, only vague recollections of a meeting taking place. Okay? But that's if it happened that way. Which is why it's an argument from an anecdote. Because argument from anecdotal evidence, again, is improvable in 99.9% of cases. The reason why things like the Apollo moon landings and JFK's assassination, 9/11, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, okay? The reason why a lot of those things are seared into people's memories is because they were extremely important events, okay? Jesus did a whole lot of miracles in a short amount of time, okay? You don't think that's extraordinary? I mean, you don't think that people aren't going to remember that? Even without the Holy Spirit helping the disciples remember later on, you're still going to remember a lot of that stuff way later on in life. Okay? I mean, yeah. And so that's why his little argument from anecdotal evidence is a logical fallacy, because you can't prove it. And he knows that, which is why he's making it. Okay? It's total fail.
According to Luke, even King Herod had heard enough reports about Jesus to believe that he could perform some miracle in his presence.
And Jesus refused in that instance. I've heard that Uri Geller is able to do legitimate magic, and I know of people who believe that he really does, even though he's been caught not being able to perform under adequate controls on several occasions. This does not mean that Uri Geller actually has magic powers. Same for Jesus here. Herod heard about a great magician, believed the stories, and then asked him to perform. Jesus then refused because that story is in one of the synoptics where his miracles were explicitly not meant to convince people of his divinity. And you...
So your proof that Jesus couldn't or wouldn't perform miracles in Herod's presence is Uri Geller, a debunked street magician? Really? All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the claims made by Jesus' opponents here, okay? So we're going to jump over to Matthew 26, verses 57 through 67. And, yeah, 57 through 67. Those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were gathered together. But Peter was following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and entered it and sat down with the officers to see the outcome. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. They did not find any, even though many false witnesses came forward. But later on, 2 came forward and said, "This man stated, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.'" The high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Now, here's where he's wrong. Okay? Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourself. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses? Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and beat him with their fists. And others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is the one who hit you?" Okay. Now, 27, starting in verse 11 and going through verse 31. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and the elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge, so the governor was quite amazed. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner whom they wanted. And at that time they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas, or Bar-Abbas, son of Abbas. So when the people were gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Who do you want me to release for you, Bar-Abbas, or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew that because of envy they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, "Have nothing to do with this righteous man, for last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. And the governor said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "And what shall I do with Jesus who is called Christ?" They all said, "Crucify him." And they said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they kept shouting all the more, saying, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves." And people said, "His blood shall be on us and our children." Then he released Barabbas for them, but after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers and the governor took Jesus to the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. And after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they knelt down before him, mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spat on him, took the reed, and began to beat him on the head. After they mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off him and put his own garments back on him and led him away to crucify him. 14. It's okay. Gosh. It's okay. 53 to 65. They led Jesus away to the high priests, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes gathered together. Peter had followed him at a distance, and right into the courtyard of the high priest. He was sitting with the officers, warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding any, for many were giving false testimony against him, but their testimony was not consistent. Gee, kind of funny. Their testimony was not consistent. False witnesses. I wonder. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, "We have heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple I made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands.'" Not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. The high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But he kept silent. He did not answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Tearing his clothes, the high priest said, "What further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy, and how does it seem to you?" And they all condemned him of deserving death. Some began to spit at him and blindfold him and beat him with their fists and say to him, "Prophesy!" And the officers received him with slaps in the face. And 15, 1 through 20. Early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the scribes, and the whole council immediately held a consultation, and binding Jesus, they led him away and delivered him to Pilate. Pilate questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "It is as you say." The chief priests began to accuse him harshly. Then Pilate questioned him, saying, "Do you not answer? See how many charges they bring against you." But Jesus made no further answer, so Pilate was amazed. Now at the feast, he used to release for them any one prisoner whom they requested. A man named Barabbas had been imprisoned with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the insurrection. The crowd went up and began asking him to do as he had been accustomed to do for them. Pilate answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he was aware that the chief priests had handed him over because of envy. The chief priests stirred up the crowd to ask him to release Barabbas for them instead. Answering them, Pilate said, "Then what shall I do with him you call the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Crucify him." But Pilate said to them, "Why, what evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." Wishing to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers took him away to the palace, that is the praetorium, and they called together the whole Roman cohort. They dressed him up in purple, and after twisting a crown of thorns, they put it on him, and he began to acclaim him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They kept beating him on the head with the reed, spitting on him, kneeling and bowing before him. After they had mocked him, they took the purple robe off him and put on his own garments, and they led him out to crucify him. Luke 22. Let's see here. I'm doing this with one hand because I have a kitty on my lap. Yes, you. Yes, I'm talking about you, Dev. What? Do you need more loves? Do you need more loves? You do? Oh, okay. He loves the chin roots. Okay. Starting in verse 63 of 22 through 23:25. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him and beating him, and they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, "Prophesy, who is the one who hit you?" And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming. When it was day, the council of elders and the people assembled, both chief priests and the scribes led him away to the council chamber, saying, "If you are the Christ, tell us." And he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. If I ask a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." And they all said, "You are the Son of God, then?" And he said to them, "Yes, I am." And he said, What further need do we have of testimony? For we have heard it for ourselves from his own mouth." Then the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding him to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ the king." So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him and said, "It is as you say." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they kept on insisting, "He stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee even as far as this place." When Pilate heard it, he asked whether this man was a Galilean. When he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself was also in Jerusalem at the time. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus. This is verse 8 here in Luke 23. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him, and was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. And Herod with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressing him in a gorgeous robe, sent him back to Pilate. Now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for they had been enemies with each other. Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers of the people, and said to them, "You brought this man to me as one who incites people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges you make against him. Nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him. Therefore I will punish him and release him." Now he was obliged to release to them at the feast one prisoner. But they cried out all together, saying, "Away with this man, and release for us Barabbas." He was the one who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection that made in the city, and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again. But they kept calling out, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." And he said to them a third time, "Why? What evil has this man done? I have found no guilt in him demanding death. Therefore I will punish him and release him." But they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail. And Pilate pronounced the sentence that their demand was granted. And then he released the man that they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but he delivered Jesus to their will. And then John 18. So there's plenty of stuff here where they talk about this kind of stuff, okay? And so, and it's pretty plain if this guy bothered to read the passage in Luke, right? He says, "Even if I told you who I was, you wouldn't believe. And even if I asked you any questions, you wouldn't answer." Okay? So, think about it. Okay? Let me see here. John 18, 12, 14. Says, so Roman cohort and the commander of the officers bound of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him, led him to Annas first, for he was father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. Then it goes into the first denial of Peter. Starting in verse 19. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews came together. I spoke nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them, and they know what I said. When he had said this, one of the officers standing struck Jesus and said, Is that the way you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong, but if rightly, why do you strike me? So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Okay, 28 through 40. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early, and they themselves did not enter into the praetorium, so they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. Therefore Pilate went out to them and said, What accusations do you bring against this man? They answered and said to him, If this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him to you. So Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. The Jews said to him, We are not permitted to put anyone to death, to fulfill the word of Jesus he spoke, signifying what kind of death he was about to die. Therefore Pilate entered again into the praetorium, summoned Jesus and said to him, Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus answered, Are you saying this on your own initiative, or did others tell you about me? Pilate answered, I'm not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. Therefore Pilate said to him, So you are a king? Jesus answered, You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate said to him, What is truth? And when he said this, he went out again to the Jews and said, I find no guilt in him. Okay. And then he said, But you have a custom that I release someone to you at the Passover. Who do you wish that I release for you? And they said, Not this man, but Barabbas. And then 19:1 through 16 says, Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, put a purple robe on him, and they began to come up to him and saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and they gave him slaps in the face. Pilate came out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him. And Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, Behold the man. When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify, crucify. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. Then the Jews answered, We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God. Therefore when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. And he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, You do not speak to me? Do you know that I have the authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you? Jesus answered, You would have no authority over me unless it was given to you from above. For this reason he who delivered me to you has the greater sin. As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judgment seat of a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now the day was preparation for the Passover, and was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, Behold your king. So they cried out, Away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. So he handed them over to be crucified. So now I ask you a question, sir. Okay? Sorry, maybe. So I ask you a question. Why would Jesus perform in front of scoffers? Because any miracle he performed, they would just either dismiss or just outright claim was a heresy, or something like that. Because here's the funniest thing, right? When you look in John, okay, go on. When you look in John, okay, I believe it's chapter 9. It's chapter 9. It's the healing of the blind man. Right? This man was born blind, the disciples come up and say, hey, teacher, whose parent sinned, the mother or the father, that caused this man to be born blind? And he goes, it's not the sin, but it's not sin, but it's the man who's going to be healed that's going to give glory to God. And so he heals him, right? We'll talk about that miracle here in a bit. But the important part is that the chief priests throw the man out of the synagogue, okay, for being healed. A miracle, right? Born blind, now he sees, and he basically just kind of talked back to the chief priests and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they tossed him out of the synagogue for it. Okay? So tell me you haven't read the Bible without telling me you haven't read the Bible. But let's say Jesus showed up at Vice Rhino's door today, like right now, today, okay? Knocked on his door, had a glass of water in his hand, okay? I just imagine this is filled with water. He has a glass of water in his hand, and he goes, hi, whoosh, here you go. Gives it to him. It's a nice Merlot. Whatever, okay? Would Vice Rhino believe in Jesus? Or would he be doing exactly what he's doing now? Yeah, thought so. Hypocrite much?
You can even see the callback to Jesus.
Okay. I mean, so even if Jesus had performed a miracle for Herod, would that have added legitimacy to his other miracles? Or would you, Vice Rhino, still claimed it was false? Again, hypocrite much? This goes back to the earlier point of Jesus being in backwater Israel and not Rome. Right? As if being in a place with more people lends some air of legitimacy to it. So let me ask you another question. Is David Copperfield one of the greatest magicians of all time? How? I mean, we know how he did most of his tricks nowadays. Right? So what makes him so endearing to you? Is it the number of people he fooled? Is it the number of tricks he performed? I mean, street magicians are still performing many of the tricks he did and still fooling many people out on the street. So the number of people or performing on demand doesn't mean automatically legit. Okay? So, I mean, you debunked your own point with Uri Geller precisely because he couldn't perform on demand. Okay? Because, and again, Jesus answers this point very succinctly in the book of Luke, about 3 verses before the verse you put on screen, buddy boy. Because he literally sits there and says, if I were to tell you, you won't believe, and if I were to ask you questions, you won't answer. So, why would he perform any miracles for Herod? In fact, I think that Jesus... sorry, cat foofies. I think that the Jesus miniseries with Jeremy Sisto did it right in that instance, because like literally when they bring him to Herod, okay, he's like asking for a sign, and he's like, oh, I just have this little ache in my knee. If you could just take care of that, And she's like, and his wife is saying, don't touch him because supposedly because he touched lepers and made them clean, she thinks that he's a leper, right? And so, because if you touched a leper, you could get leprosy. And then he sends him back to Pilate, and then Pilate questions him right out of the book of John, and Pilate was played by Gary Oldman, and wonderfully so, I might add. Gary Oldman is an amazing actor, and you know, because there's the one part where when he says, "I'm not a Jew," right? Your own people have handed you over to me. Like, he actually gets kind of angry. He's like, "Well, I'm not a Jew. Your own chief priests and people handed you over to me." So yeah, it's really a great scene. I loved that interaction between Sisto and Oldman. And they also have some things where, like, one of the instigators is actually like a Roman, like, perfunctory of Pilate, who kind of goes around and talks to the chief priests. Kind of acts as a little bit of like a go-between between the chief priests and Pilate. And it's like, after Jesus is up on the cross and he's been crucified, he says, you know, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And like, that perfunctory guy is like, "We know exactly what we're doing, Messiah," you know, kind of scoffing at him. And it was a really great miniseries. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It's a wonderfully done miniseries. Kind of mostly comes from the book of John. They have a few instances, but it kind of picks up like the book of John in Jesus' adulthood, and then there's like a few flashback sequences in the beginning to kind of show his birth, and then him at the temple when they're 12, and then when Jesus is 12, and then like there's a few other things that happen. Yeah, so it was a really, really well done miniseries. If you haven't seen it, check it out. But anyway, yeah, just so much fail so far. And we're about halfway through the video, and we're a little over halfway through my notes. So we're getting there. So smash that like button, hit subscribe, drop a comment below. Let me know what you think of this series so far. And as we say, we'll see you on the next one.